Right. It's on the hour. We've got 8 participants so far. I see we've got the chair of our specification work team, Mark. You've got the chair of our onboarding work team, Nathan. Happy New Year to you both. Okay, so I'm just going to display our antitrust policy notice before we get started. As usual, if you have any questions, you can first of all see our full policy on the website, and you can contact our antitrust counsel, Andy Up to Grove, at any time. As always, we show that at the beginning of every meeting for a minute or two. I see we have more people joining. Excellent. It's nice to have a little bit of a crowd because, of course, this is our first meeting of 2021. Since the last meeting, quite a few things have happened. The release of OpenChain as ISO IEC 5230 has had an impact. We, of course, were published in mid-December. And the impact immediately has been that quite a few companies have started to certify against the ISO standard. You'll be seeing some announcements from OpenChain in the next couple of weeks about companies doing that. We also hear from our partners around the world that many of their clients were waiting for the ISO release and are now beginning adoption. So it's a very busy time for market rollout. And that makes this call, our work team calls, more important than ever. Because what we do now to gather feedback about the standard, and that's Mark's specification work team, will be critical to make sure people feel welcome and heard. What we do to refine our marketing material, our onboarding material, will be important to make sure that we compensate for any gaps we might have in making new companies feel welcome, making new industries feel that they can understand things. And of course, what we do on the reference library will be vital. We're getting feedback about the type of new reference material people want, and hopefully we can focus on that as well. I think the project news will come in a minute. The first thing I'd like to do is to show a proposition that came up based on feedback. We've had a few people from both small and large companies who are uncomfortable with the way that we currently schedule the bi-weekly meetings. Our current schedule sees at the first Monday of the month, the United States and Europe being able to join the call during daytime or evening hours. On the third Monday, we have a call that allows the United States and Asia to join. For the United States, it's afternoon. For Asia, it is morning the next day. But we have had feedback that people are not comfortable with this schedule. They want to be able to attend the meetings directly and provide feedback. They're not comfortable with the fact that if someone is in Asia, they can only participate once a month, or someone in Europe, it's the same deal. So there has been a proposition to adjust the timing, to keep the bi-weekly schedule, but have the actual timing alter. That essentially puts both the US and Asia into either daytime and morning or late evening, and it puts Europe in the middle. This was actually suggested by one of our contributors in Germany, but they didn't put themselves in the middle for expedience. It's because that was the only way they could find to cross 17 hours of time zones. So I wanted to show you this and get your initial feedback on moving to this schedule for our global work team calls and our global webinars so that everyone can attend them live. Let's pause here and see if you have feedback, positive or negative.
So for Germany, that's quite comfortable.
Yeah, it's got one early morning and one afternoon for you, which is not too bad.
Yeah, fine for UK, and I'm happy with that as well.
It's a very early morning for you there in the UK.
But in the summer it's fine, and in the winter I'll manage with it. It's easier than it is for you. So.
Yeah, we had the early morning hit the UK, and then the other place that was hit with a bad timing is Tokyo at 11 p.m. But
yeah,
that was sort of the best we could do. Right. If there's no strong objections, then we will probably move to this schedule for our next call using schedule 2, which will put it in evening in Asia, morning in US, and afternoon in Europe and UK.
Jane, this is Nathan.
Hi.
Yeah, hey, I do notice, like, on the US side, it is a little, they are a little more difficult times. I know they've historically been more convenient times, and so I don't mind it balancing things out. I just don't want to inhibit some growth we may have, though, if we're trying to get people in the US more broadly on board, outside of the typical industries we have. So I know with, like, kind of 3 big sets of time frames we're trying to synchronize. It's hard to make it ideal for all 3 of them with only 2 meetings. And it doesn't seem like, I don't know if we have enough crowd yet for 3 kind of meetings yet. Do you think?
Yeah. Well, Nathan, I was just thinking about that. What I can do is, at least for the spec, is just,
Yeah.
once a month, hold a kind of out of cycle meeting for those in those time zones, to put it in the middle. That's one possibility. I agree with you. I'm not sure we have enough for 3 meetings, but I can, every once a month, just kind of consider an out of cycle meeting for the spec.
Well, here's an adjacent proposition. We just launched the US work group in December. So it's entirely possible that we can put some of the heavy lifting onto the US work group. And for example, in Asia, the Chinese work group and the Japanese work group and the Korean work group. So that, on schedule 1, when it's a late time in the Pacific, some people mightn't be able to make it, but they could make a monthly US call. And the same for schedule 2. The Japan work group might be able to have a meeting in Japanese and China in Chinese and so on. So maybe we can look at accelerating the regional work group meetings to allow for that. What do you think?
Shane, I'm wondering, do you feel like with the regional work group meetings, like gaining more role, does that change the nature of these meetings that we're having?
I have noticed that in Korea and Japan and now in India, we do see that the local work groups tend to work on work products and then use the global meeting to express what they're doing and see if someone else wants to join. So based on the trend, yes, I think that it's likely that peers in a nearby geography will frequently collaborate to make a work product that gets presented to the global teams and seeks collaboration, but is essentially led by a region.
Well, yeah, and what I wonder, Shane, is if we, one thing we could do is have like this meeting kind of once a month with more of a formal, bigger agenda, and then just rotate it, for a convenient time for, the Americas, Europe, and Asia, and so there's kind of like a more like unified meeting for kind of project-wide issues, and then we have the work groups for everything else.
Yeah, I think that if the global meeting evolves, that's totally fine. My suggestion then is to take the bi-weekly schedule and keep it at this juncture as we try to increase the activity. For instance, the US work group just launched. And once the regional work groups appear to be, let's say, self-sufficient, then we might reduce global to once a month or so. My only concern in doing it immediately is because, for instance, the US work group is very new and the UK is just getting started and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But certainly we could aim explicitly to try to make the local work groups, because we know that's where the tightest collaboration happens, the local work groups in the US and so on, self-sufficient with a target maybe of shifting in Q2 or beginning of Q3 to monthly global meetings of sharing of minds.
Yeah, just an idea. So
it's a good idea, because then we could have presentations from the country groups on this call. Yeah.
So I do think with this schedule, it may be a little tougher to get some newer people on. I think schedule 2 is when we'll usually get our US folks then, is you know, because East Coast, this isn't that bad for East Coast US.
Yeah, I mean, the feedback about adjusting the schedule came out of Europe and Asia, because people were happy that they couldn't attend half of the global meetings. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense that, that people would say that. So.
Right, okay, I'll throw it to the larger list and see what happens. Thanks for talking through this and some great ideas. Let's have a quick look at the things we're going to do. Okay, so project status, we have the ISO standard. We have people already conforming to the ISO standard. We've heard from our partners that their clients are moving on it. A lot of their clients were waiting for it. So that's very exciting. In 2021, we just had a board meeting, and the board had consensus about aspects of general strategy. In essence, to help companies adopt this, to start in the ecosystem that is inherently most receptive. Now, this isn't about what our partners will do. I mean, many of our partners are multinationals in themselves and will reach far across the globe. But in terms of the project marketing, and this isn't limiting your action, it's really about what my budget will do, I'm going to be focusing a lot on LF member companies. So we have 1,600 companies already cognizant of the importance of open source processes, open source collaboration. So that dialogue doesn't have to be done by us. And instead we can focus on actually explaining why this standard fits into cloud computing, AGL, and why it's imperative to use. Another thing that came up was the importance of continuing our educational activities. Our webinars have provided the largest corpus of information, unbiased, not selling, about the field of compliance anywhere with our bi-weekly webinars last year. And continuing that seems vital, so that when people are trying to enter this field, they can look to OpenChain as the appropriate industry starting point, not just as a standard, but as a place to get a grip on this, which fits into the spirit of our standard as the overarching approach to compliance. And in addition to that, to continue to explicitly put our resources into doing things like making sure we have critical documents translated, making sure that we work closely in various regions around the world, like China, UK, Germany, US, Japan, with government organizations, so that they're also supported in their policy making and so on. So in broad strokes, the OpenChain project in terms of capital spend and staff time will be focusing on helping make sure the Linux Foundation ecosystem of over 1,600 companies is prepped and ready. We're going to focus on continuing our educational activity with bi-weekly webinars and so on. And we're going to invest time in talking to governments and standardization organizations. I should stress here that we're not starting from zero on talking to governments. In fact, as an outcome of the ISO activities, we had a lot of the governments and the standardization organizations come to us and say, let's work together. So we're going to grab that and work with it. So in broad strokes, that's where the project is going on a how we spend our capital. But I wanted to see ISO adoption continue to be the center of compliance, the corporate landing place to get compliance rolling, and make sure that long-term things like government policy are cognizant of this and include it. I wanted to pause and see, are there other goals that you want us to do, either in terms of the staff time and funding, or this work group and local work groups? Are there goals you would like to accomplish in 2021?
Hey, Shane, this is
Shane, Jeff, go ahead.
Sure, I was just going to say, as someone who's been somewhat kind of on the periphery of the OpenChain standard over the last couple of years, one of my new roles, I just started a new job as a kind of a director of open source at a fintech company.
Oh, nice.
And one of my jobs is to come in, and one of the reasons I brought in is put in a culture of compliance, put in a culture of OpenChain, get us conformant. And it's always interesting when you're on one side of the standard and you're on the other side of the standard. You're kind of coming in from a green field. And it's very eye-opening when you say, oh, I wish I had this document, or I wish I had this, this particular, more complete policy, that's more than a single page. And so I'd say, kind of as we look to folks who are becoming conformant and are kind of coming in from the green field, from industries who didn't build the standard, but are people who are now rolling out the standard, I think there's going to be a bunch of documentation, a bunch of checklists, a bunch of, start here, ask IT for the following resources, these 3 email aliases, et cetera, et cetera. So just continue working on the checklist, continue working on the more than just sample docs, but pretty much as close to be possible final docs where people just have to put a checkbox here or there. Here's our policy. Here's how we handle code with no known license. Here's how we deal with web services, and so on and so on. It's kind of flesh out the things that are beyond the standard, that are the things that help the standard to get rolled out at this company.
And to that point, well, I was just going to say, in Airtable, we have a lot to learn. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, hi, Nathan.
Oh, hey, I was just going to say something similar to what Jeff said is, I'd like to see, and especially on the onboarding side, continue to work on creating really polished material for, and I've always liked the path to conformance because it helped address everyone along the, the spectrum of just getting to know us versus, trying to implement things. And so I'd like to get some official core materials, that's really polished along all those steps, by the end of the year. And so I'm spending some more time on, I have one more big slide deck that I'm working on, for the kind of intro one. I'm updating that. And so I'm hoping that'll be kind of the, part of the intro piece, and, we'll try to get translated with some of our partners and things like that. But yeah, I know there's some middle areas that we need help on, and I think some things out of the work groups might be useful, some of the resources people are bringing in. So, maybe if anything, this is more of a creating a channel so that, we can start pulling in the best stuff that people are using.
Yes.
And then officially blessing them. And so, yeah, I guess I'd like to see that this year, and that will help people, do this a lot more easily. So
that's a good point. I mean, we're already touching on, at the entrance point and process point, the path to conformance, a kind of guide, and then secondary checklists and simple material like that to increasing our checklists. We have some, but explicitly building out on that. And it sounds like, if the intro slide for path to conformance is underway. That's a great start there, and we can put that into collaborative editing. And on the checklists, those sound like we could have some easy early wins on checklists. So yeah, my suggestion is, how about we put out a call? So I don't know if you're willing to do this, Jeff, but Nathan, if we put out a call to people that the slide deck's coming soon and be ready to collaborate, we can do a special meeting online or whatnot to get started. And on the checklists, if you're willing to do pretty much the same, you know, put out a call on the mailing list and try to get a few people involved and see what checklist we could start to work on now.
Sure, this is Jeffrey. I'd definitely be into that. I'm keeping a diary of my OpenChain corporate onboarding, let's call it.
Okay.
And you know, I see that as a, you know, I'm working backward from a year, saying I want to be conformant within a year at the organization I'm at, and it takes X, Y, Z. So I think there's things I can definitely do in the short term, but I think the long term will be all of us who are coming from a green field. You know, what's helpful, what's required in a place where they don't have this rolled out yet. So definitely interested in helping out. Definitely can help out. I also see it as a long-term process.
And it sounds like we might be able to use these two activities to help seed, for instance, the US work group. You know, if in the US work group, people took an action item to, let's say, work on those slides and do some of these checklists, people could get together in their time zone, get the ball rolling, and then it can go out to global and then to the other regions. And I'm sure that if we had some of the material underway, we'd probably see an uptick in contribution from Korea and Japan as well. Not to say they mightn't just jump in anyway, but I think that might get it going. Okay, that's two activities. Another one on the specification. Well, Mark, this is no surprise, but I'm guessing our key thing is to continue the specification work group exactly as before, to gather all that information, put in issues, and to consider what's important. One thing I wanted to just bring to you, Mark, was that I've had a lot of feedback about the potential for those extensions in security and export control to OpenChain. And not necessarily about changing the standard, but in having reference material about what you can do to extend OpenChain to these domains.
Right, and we were going to explore that this year. I think that's very complementary to where we want to go. And the idea would be more to look at these as options that you get, because OpenChain conformance itself is table stakes. You got to have that core no matter what, right? But these others are just, you know, if you want to have that extension for security or export, or even, I think, functionally safe software, I think those are natural options. So I think that's going to be very consistent with where we want to go.
And probably that explicit approach will get the most attention. Generally, people don't get confused that we're going to, you know, expand the domain of the standard and so on. Generally, people understand that we're pretty much looking at additional reference material to fill in those gaps at this juncture, optional extensions to the ISO standard. So I think the messaging will not be difficult and the contribution will be high. Just scheduling the appropriate time to do that in detail. What do you think about doing that in detail at our first mini summit? And I'll preface this by saying, I'm thinking we have 4 mini summits this year. Basically one at the LF member event, which is, I think, March or April. And then Open Source Summit, North America, Europe, and Japan. But not to hold the mini summits inside the event platform, to actually hold them here on Zoom. So people don't have to register to the whole event. They can just drop into the OpenChain thing and be part of that. But it'd be same timing. So all the people going to the event could use our schedule. And in March, if we had a dedicated time to talk through extensions, what do you think, Mark?
No, I think it's great. I think it's really, really what we'd like to experiment and go that this year, and it sounds like we might be pushed a little. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, and there's another thing that I'd like to see, and we just had an education call work group. It's led by Balakrishna in India, but it's got a lot of international contributors. They have a roadmap and a plan to be almost ready to deploy around March, and to, again, take an hour of the mini summit to go through the education material that will go to edx.org and invite comments, edits, and improvements. So it could be a really exciting mini summit where we look at extensions to the spec, plus an online free course as training material. So that,
Yeah. I think as far as the extensions are concerned, it's very consistent with what we've done in the past. And I think we always have to give that sense of, how does it fit into the mission? And it's ultimately about building trust around the use of open source. And when I say that, clearly you want to be compliant. That's part of being trusting your supply chain. You're getting stuff. But clearly also you want to trust the open source with respect to the security aspects, as well as the export, as well as the functionally safe stuff. So I think that that's an overarching theme to accommodate all of this. Again, it hasn't changed anything. It's just, I wanted to emphasize the fact that ultimately we're about building trust in the use of open source.
And of course, this is all demand driven. For instance, talking with NTIA, the telecommunications agency in the US, they're explicitly looking at security and open source, but they're looking at OpenChain as well as SPDX. So their questions are really, how does this fit into the security domain? And
well, it's interesting. I've been at a few of those meetings, and I bring up the very basic fact that whether you're doing compliance, security, or whatever, everything starts with a bill of materials, and it's core to our spec. The bill of materials is so core to the spec. It's one of the key sections of our spec, and that no one's going to be able to do that. And I also emphasize that where companies are going to do this first, like they want to do it for all software. So if you have a software solution, they want to build a bill of material. Well, they want to do the BOM for the bill of materials for security for all of your software, proprietary and open source. But I believe the early adoption, most people are very focused on organizing their open source and a bill of materials around the open source for compliance reasons, first and foremost. And I was trying to emphasize to them that that's really where your early adopters are going to come from, but that didn't really stick. So, I mean, I don't, but that's okay. I mean, I think it doesn't stick, but I do believe that's where it's going to go first.
we'll get there. I just noticed we had some people unmute. If you want to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, I was just about to say, this is Prasad. Good evening, Shane, and good morning, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. I just wanted to add to that earlier comment on the SPDX. From our perspective, from Cisco's side, there are quite a few customers who are already looking at adopting the SPDX as their standard format for any of the software BOMs. And I think it might be a good idea, at least from guidance standpoint. I think we go to conform to, because SPDX is obviously, it's still evolving. There are several versions. So we have, I think one of our latest versions is 2.2, I believe last year I checked, yes. But there is another version that is under development. It might be a good idea to, come up with an idea to kind of what we want to adopt in terms of early adopters of the standard, what version that they can start with might be a good idea for our OpenChain to kind of discuss and set some sort of a guideline, because there is a lot of customers from our end who are quite keen on adopting to the SPDX, depending on how we will adopt, right? Like if we adopt a given version, they are more than happy to follow suit, and that will help us pave to adapting more people the software BOM standards, common standard.
That's a very good point. So I'll coordinate with Kate at SPDX. My understanding is that SPDX 2.2 is going to be in play for a while. So it has been submitted to ISO under the fast track, same as OpenChain. And it will graduate probably around Q2, early Q3. But SPDX is simultaneously working on SPDX 3. And I'll double check their plan. Do they plan to submit that as an update relatively quickly in ISO or not? And I guess that will determine if we point people at 2.2 or 3.
Yeah, that'll be very helpful, Shane. I think because I do have some of our murky customers who have in fact already working on potential systems that will absorb and consume this software bill of materials. And I think, as the gentleman earlier mentioned, they're envisioning a future where any of these exchanges, for when it comes to software bill of materials, will always adopt this new standard. So it'll be good for them to get a guidance on which version they can start with, especially with any major versions. From what I heard from our prior discussions on the SPDX format, is there is some potential changes to the underlying attributes. So it might make sense to kind of start with 2.2. If that is the latest, I think that'll be good to know. But yeah, either way, I think it's helpful if we can get some confirmation there. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll take that as an action item.
Just for the sake of, I want to make one clarification so that we're all talking about the same thing. The bill of materials is integral to the spec. Like, that means you create a bill of materials however you do that, maybe in a database, spreadsheet, whatever. SPDX is very powerful when you're exchanging or sharing that bill of materials with another organization. It's a format for which you map your bill of materials into. So I don't want people to be confused. I mean, the spec says you should create a bill of materials, right? Internally, however you want to do it. And SPDX, I think, serves that role when you want to exchange between organizations that bill of materials. I think that's an important distinction because it has a specific existence within the spec.
And of course, people must be free to make alternative choices, a different bill of materials if they wish.
Yeah, absolutely. They should be able to choose different alternatives, although we suspect SPDX will probably be a dominant one. And also, I think that we shouldn't confuse them and think that bill of materials in the spec is SPDX. It means you have a method or a process for creating and constructing a bill of materials. And hopefully that tooling or that method has a way of mapping it nicely into SPDX. Usually it does. But I just want to put that out there because I have a feeling that's going to be confusion if we don't make that clear going forward.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think they should just see it as a mechanism to exchange data as opposed to the only way, right? Like, as far as their internal systems within the organization, I think they can do whatever they want, but it's just mostly for the exchange information. The reason why the customers reached out to us was many of them, they rely on our license documentation that Cisco provides for all our products. And many of them, in addition to the current formats that we usually provide, they also expect our materials to be in the SPDX format, which is something that they have obviously realized that is industry standard, and it's at least getting popular. So they are that's where I think the interest or the driving factor coming from. But definitely, it's the right thing to clarify to them that it is an evolving standard, and it will, obviously the spec is going to evolve, but at least we will start from somewhere, depending on which version that we as a forum will adopt to, and we will set that expectations with them, with our customers, to ensure they follow that same standard.
I guess one of the educational contributions we can make is that when people are looking at a software bill of materials, they never think that there isn't a standard or material, that they are channeled towards realizing that this work has been done And here are some of your options.
Yep, makes sense.
All righty. So for next steps, let's gather those next steps. One, Nathan's going to go forward with the slides for onboarding. We'll talk about it on the main list, but perhaps we'll target especially the US work group to get rolling on that. The same deal, Jeff, with the checklists to get the discussion rolling on the main list, and then task the US work group to maybe spit out a few. We have spec working on the extensions. We have education working on our online training. And we'll have a mini summit around March where spec will have a lot of time to dig into extensions. Education will have time to go through our online course and adjust it. And then of course we can have the checklists and the onboarding slides reviewed as well. So it sounds like we've got a pretty good plan. My next thing is to go to Kate and confirm exactly what's happening with SPDX in terms of ISO. And we're on to any other business. Is there anything else you'd like us to talk about today? All right. Thank you all very much for coming. This was a very productive meeting. I really appreciate your time. Happy New Year, and please have a lovely day.
Thanks, Shane. Okay.